everybody, and welcome to another beautiful Thursday morning. You're listening to Bhavani at iEat Green on the Progressive Radio Network. I have a great show for you today. My guest will be Sanjay Rawal. He is a award-winning film director, and he has a new film out called Gather. And I will be introducing him and telling you more about his film in just a little bit. But first, I want to go over some things going on in and around the news, share some ways that you can take action, and of course, share my weekly recipe with you. First, I guess it's pretty obvious what's in the news. Yesterday was quite a historical day. I woke up, with anticipation, waiting to hear the results of the Georgian election. I heard we, won the first Georgian senator seat and was so excited and was waiting anxiously to hear the second, and then everything broke out in DC. We had a group of Americans who took it upon themselves, incited by our own president, to stampede the Capitol and to take it over and to create violence. And it was just a horrendous day yesterday, and it was just amazing to see the lack of police force there. Here we are, all since the summer, since the killing of George Floyd, we have witnessed the police brutality with peaceful marches and rallies across the country going violent by the police. And here are violent Americans stampeding the Capitol, and the police step aside. They barely do anything. They almost invite them in. They take selfies with them. It's just horrendous. I mean, when it all said and done, out of thousands of people, they arrested 15 people. That's unbelievable. Every single person that was inside that Capitol should have been arrested. It's just unbelievable, the discrepancy and the disparity over how white terrorists are dealt with compared to peaceful people of diverse backgrounds. It's just, the inequality is just so alarming and so prevalent and so in our face. It's just so easy to see. And what are we going to do about it? That's really the question. And I'm sure I'll be getting more into this conversation when I talk with my guest today. But I encourage us all to sign any petitions that come our way to remove this president from office. I know we only have 2 weeks left before the inauguration, so it almost seems like, why waste our time to remove him? But in 2 weeks, he can do a lot of damage. Look at all the damage he has done in his 4 years. And just in the last few months of the pardons he's done and the inciting of violence that he's done, having this deranged man have his finger on, wars and trade agreements and everything, it's just really, really scary. One of the things that I did want to talk about today before yesterday's situations happened, I want to talk about this new regulation that is coming out that will tie the hands of the Environmental Protection Agency. And I wrote about this months ago when it was voted on, but it's actually starting yesterday, it went into effect. And this is a new regulation that prohibits the Environmental Protection Agency from looking at any scientific studies that used the public. So whether it's studies to see how air pollution is affecting a population or toxic water is affecting a population. When these studies are done, people's information is kept confidential. People don't want their personal information known. And yet the people running the studies have the information, but it's private. Well, they are saying, and they're kind of greenwashing the term transparency, because we all want transparency in how our foods are made and transparency and how our pharmaceuticals are made. Transparency is good, but when it's affecting someone's privacy, it's not. And so they're using the term transparency. They're actually calling it the transparency regulation. They are using it so that the EPA can no longer use these scientific studies that use the public in their scientific studies. So it's really prohibiting them from using the studies that have created protections like the Clean Water Act and the Fresh Air Act. So this is really, really a scary situation. And hopefully when the Biden administration gets in there, they will be able to reverse this because it's really, really scary. Okay, ways that you can take action. Well, like I said, just started before, if you see a petition come your way to sign on to ask Congress to invoke the 25th Amendment, I think that's a really great thing to sign on to. We need to get this president out. We need to do it fast. But another thing that I would like to ask you to do is I put up on my website a petition to demand the Biden administration move us towards a fossil-free future. And the current administration has done so much damage over the last 4 years towards moving us in a lower carbon footprint future. We need the Biden administration to really step up to the plate and do all they can to reverse the damage that Trump has done and to instill a feeling of taking climate change real, making it real, and doing things that need to be done, making the hard choices that need to happen, although they shouldn't be such hard choices. They should be obvious choices to move us away from fossil fuel and towards alternative energies. So that's my talk for the day. I'd like to share this week's recipe. I've been making lots of soups, with the cold weather coming in and trying to keep our immune system strong. This is a cream of mushroom soup, not a Campbell's can that you're going to open up and douse with milk. This is a vegan cream of mushroom soup that uses some cashews and a little miso to make a really delicious broth. So I'm going to first tell you the ingredients you need and then tell you how to do it. 1/4 cup of olive oil, 10 shiitake mushrooms, stems removed and then sliced, 12 baby bella mushrooms or cremini mushrooms, brushed off and sliced. Just so for those that don't know, when you're using mushrooms, you don't ever want to run mushrooms underwater because they're so porous, they would absorb the water and then they will not saute up well. So to clean mushrooms, you can dampen a light paper towel or cloth or even just a dry brush and brush them off. That's the best way to clean the mushrooms. You also want 1/2 cup of dried mushrooms, which you're going to pour some boiling water over and let those soak. You can let them soak for up to 2 hours. 1 onion chopped, 2 cups of chopped leeks, 2 shallots, 2 teaspoons plus 2 teaspoons of chopped garlic, because we're going to be sauteing the bulk mushrooms for the pureed soup in one pot, and then we're going to be sauteing mushrooms to use as a garnish in another. So that's why it's 2 teaspoons plus 2 teaspoons of chopped garlic. Same for the herbs. We want 1 teaspoon of herbs de Provence for the soup pot and also 1 for the sauteing of the mushrooms. So total of 2 teaspoons of herbs de Provence. 1/2 cup of white wine, 1 teaspoon salt and 1/2 teaspoon pepper, 1/2 cup of cashews that you're also going to soak for 2 hours in water, 2 tablespoons white miso, 6 cups of water, 1/4 cup of aji marin, that's a sweet rice wine. Make sure you get a good brand, like Eden makes a really good brand of aji marin that is made from sweet rice wine and seaweed, and that's all that's in it. Kikkoman puts out a mirin that they even sell at Whole Foods, and if you look at the ingredients, it's just glucose water. It is not real aji marin. You also want 2 tablespoons of tamari and then some fresh chopped parsley for garnish. You can use parsley. You could also use cilantro if you're a cilantro lover. So in a large stock pot, you're going to saute the leeks, the shallots, and the onions. with the 2 teaspoons of garlic. And you're going to saute that for a while till it gets soft. Drain the soaked mushrooms, chop them up, and add them to the pot with the onions. And saute this mixture for about 10 minutes until everything's soft. Then you're going to add the water and bring that to a boil and reduce the heat and let that simmer. Add the salt and the herbes de Provence and let that cook down for about 10 minutes. Meanwhile, in a heavy saute pan, you're going to saute the mushrooms. That's the fresh mushrooms in a little olive oil with the 2 teaspoons of minced garlic that you kept separated. And you're going to add that other teaspoon of the herbes de Provence and saute those mushrooms for about 10 minutes. You're going to add the mirin and the tamari and cook for a few more minutes until the liquid is absorbed. So you're basically caramelizing those mushrooms that you're sauteing. And then you're going to set those aside. And after the soup's made, we can add those mushrooms in, or you can even just put a big tablespoon of each of those sauteed mushrooms into each bowl separately as garnish. So now you're going to drain the cashews, and in the blender, you're going to add the cashews, the miso, and 3 cups of that soup mixture and puree it till it's all smooth. Return that pureed soup back into the soup pot. You can either add the sauteed mushrooms now, or you can save them and add them individually to each bowl. Taste the soup for flavoring, whether you want to add more salt or pepper, more herbes de Provence. And then you're going to ladle the soup into each individual bowl, garnish it with the parsley and the sauteed mushrooms, and that's it. It is a really delicious, delicious dish. So I hope you make it. I love feedback, so please feel free to send me comments. And you can find these all on my website at ieatgreen.com. And now it's my pleasure to introduce all of you to my guest, Sanjay Rawal. He is the director of the new documentary film Gather, and I'm so happy to have him on. He spent the 15 years of his beginning career on human rights campaigns globally before making his first feature film, which was called Food Chains, which I actually showed as a screening with my slow food chapter. And Food Chains is a great film. It's an expose on the abuse and exploitation of the Immokalee farm workers. They're a group of workers in Florida that were, really being taken advantage of. And this film really brought light to that situation. And we'll talk more about that when Sanjay comes on. But the film premiered at the Berlin Film Festival in 2014 and then had a US premiere at the Tribeca Film Festival. And it went on to win awards. It won a James Beard Award for the special documentary category. And it also was the BritDoc Documentary Impact Award. And it's now being shown on Netflix if you want to see Food Chains. And then his most recent film right now is called Gather. And because of the pandemic, that was released directly to digital form back in September. And it also has been receiving great accolades. The New York Times critics picked it for an award. And actually, Lovia, I don't know how to say her last name, Quarke, wrote, "The film wonderfully weaves personal stories with archival footage that contextualizes the continued violence against Native Americans. Rawal covers a substantial amount of ground and deftly balances the dense material without losing sight of the mission driving the bigger story. Healing from generational trauma sometimes starts with just one person." And the film shares some beautiful stories while raising the awareness that we all need to have about the continued struggle of the Native Americans in this country. So I'm really thrilled. Sanjay, are you with me?
I am. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm well, considering. How are you?
Good. Good. Can you believe what happened yesterday? Oh my God.
I can believe it, actually. I mean, I'm not surprised in the least.
I guess neither am I, but I guess I expected there to be some precautions taken because, like, you're not surprised. I'm not surprised. Everyone knew it was coming. He's been talking about this for months now, ever since he lost the election. It's just amazing that the police were not, I don't know if they were ready for it and just purposely stood aside or what was going on, but it was
Well,
pretty amazing.
we all know that there's a dark history of white supremacy and policing. The police forces that were developed in the late 1800s basically came out of two activities. Number one, patrolling for slaves, both in the North and the South. In the South, escaped slaves. In the North, slaves that were out past 8 or 9 p.m., the sundowner curfew. At the same time, those militia were also set up to steal Native American land for farmers and to protect those farmers from natives coming to retake their land. And so there's always been an aspect of white supremacy in the way law enforcement has been organized. And natives have bore the brunt of it over the last 250 years, as well as African Americans post Reconstruction. So to see the explicit condoning of terrorism by a population that was not brown-skinned by law enforcement is not surprising in the least, particularly how they've treated Native Americans who protested environmental and other sorts of human rights abuses.
Yeah. Well, the news was describing them as thugs and bullies, and yeah, that's how I would describe so many police, right? As thugs and bullies. So anyway, as you said, it's not so surprising. Okay. So I wanted to just, before we actually get into your films, I wanted to first ask you what inspired you to change careers after working, on human rights issues. What made you change careers and become a filmmaker and a storyteller?
Well, in a sense, it was a progression. I worked on a lot of human rights campaigns, not in war zones, but in conflict zones, areas where there were armed conflict, but just not at the same type of profile as Iraq or Afghanistan. And there were a lot of war reporters that were coming through those areas for different agencies, including the New York Times. And in many cases, apart from them coming in for a week at a time, I was the only person on the ground with the camera. And a number of professional photographers encouraged me to document what I was working on and what I was seeing. And as cameras began to shoot video, mid-aughts, I began shooting little clips and started making some short movies that I guess weren't terrible because people watched them, and it kind of gave me encouragement to push further. At the same time, on the actual project side, the projects that I enjoyed the most were the ones where the target populations, folks on the ground, had complete control over how their story was being told. How the funds they were getting were being used. It wasn't kind of a patriarchal or paternal relationship with philanthropy, but more of access to capital. And in a sense, I saw the importance of letting people tell their own stories. And I kind of found myself, telling stories myself for them.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about your first film, Food Chains, which, woke me up to the struggle of the Immokalee workers. And it was just such an eye-opening film. Let's talk a little bit about that and some of the ramifications that came out of your making that film.
Well, thank you. Every film is personal, and my background, my family is actually in agriculture. Food Chains, as you mentioned, is about tomato workers in southern Florida called the CIW, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. My dad was a tomato scientist. I grew up in California, never once thought about labor. At the same time, I was working on agricultural labor, human rights issues overseas in Africa and Southeast Asia. And in 2011, my dad sent me a book by Barry Estabrook called Tomatoland, which chronicled not just the modern day slavery, the sexual harassment in the field, the wage theft that was happening in southern Florida, but this group of workers that realized that the culprits weren't the farmers, weren't the farm managers per se. It was the market itself. It was the fact that gigantic grocery chains controlled the supply chain to such an extent that labor conditions were terrible and tolerated, and that number two, that farm workers were still being paid at wages that could barely, that hadn't changed since the 1970s. These workers had understood that the way to change the system was at the top, with the McDonald's, with the Taco Bells, with the Walmarts. They subsequently won the MacArthur Fellowship, the Genius Award, for this analysis and for the work they've done to create equity in a system that was created out of inequity. I mean, farm labor issues are a direct legacy of slavery. I mean, America's first economy for its first 100 plus years was entirely agricultural. And that's the reason why North America was colonized. It was for land. There was no other economy. And labor issues and land issues all kind of intertwined to create economies of scale. And that's really what food chains exposes, the food system and its connection to some of the most horrific injustices in American history.
Yeah. I mean, not only do farm workers not get paid overtime, but they're paid per piece. And, and for so many of them, they're working, I guess right now because I'm a board member of the Northeast Organic Farming Association, and there's this law being I don't know if it's a regulation that is being relooked at, right now, as you mentioned, farm workers don't get paid overtime, right? They are not part of the labor laws that we have that includes every other type of worker other than a household help or farm workers, and they're not protected by the overtime. And, and so right now with this regulation trying to look at whether farm workers should start getting paid time and a half after 40 hours or whether it should be 60 hours, farmers won't give them the overtime because especially some of the small farmers that I'm talking about. The big, large farmers certainly could afford time and a half, but some of these smaller farmers who feel like they can't afford time and a half.
I mean, look, the way I approach it is from the top. I mean, Walmart did about $390 billion in grocery sales. So 3 out of every $4 that comes through Walmart goes into food. And out of that 380 billion, nearly 80 or 90 billion actually came from federal food stamps. So we're actually literally paying for Walmart. That said, in 1986, Walmart entered into the grocery business and they created a supply chain tsunami. They basically began buying gigantic quantities at very low margins. In a sense, if you were a farmer and you scaled up, you could have guaranteed contracts and a guaranteed income, even though the margins were lower. But what that resulted in was 70 or 80 other grocery chains having to consolidate because Walmart was able to pass those cost savings on to customers. So food costs have been exceptionally low. Farmers are getting a much smaller percentage of it. And these massive companies, the majority of which are extraordinarily conservative, right-wing controlled, are basically funneling dollars from the farming system into their shareholders' pockets. Grocery stores dwarf, almost every other industry. Google, for example, globally did about 40 or $50 billion in gross revenue, probably $10 billion of which was profit. I mean, Walmart did 10 times that amount. Safeway, Kroger, Publix, Trader Joe's, these companies all regularly out-earn other companies that we consider big. Of course, the margins are lower, but they control the supply chains below them. So I think this focus on farmers being the problem, really doesn't take into account the fact that the food system is controlled by a handful of corporations. And for them, paying, in the case of the Immokalee workers, one penny
more, right,
per pound, 1 penny
right.
more. We're paying $2.99 per pound, $1.50 per pound for tomatoes. 1 penny more per pound doubles the wages of farm workers, not just adds a couple dollars of overtime, but actually creates a living wage. That system in Southern Florida has worked. And it's just amazing that we haven't been able to see the expansion of that throughout the entire supply chain in the US. Although now that system has been adopted by Walmart throughout its Northeastern supply chain as well. I think that's the future. It's not fighting for dollars here and scraps there from low-level suppliers like farmers.
Hmm. I hear you, but right now, what I'm also hearing is this struggle um, of farm workers not wanting their hours cut. Like they'd rather work 60 hours without overtime than have their hours cut to just 40 hours because the farmer doesn't want to pay time and a half. So, it's just this, it's just a situation going on right now that, I don't really know what the answer is. And I hear you that we need to get the supply chain has to be fixed from the top up. I mean, these corporations, I believe there's still a boycott going on with Wendy's because they're the one fast food chain that has not still, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe they still are not willing to pay the extra penny, right?
I mean,
But McDonald's, Burger King, they have.
that's correct. I mean, at the heart of everything is the lack of protections for farm workers to unionize. Farm labor and domestic workers were the only class of workers excluded from the Federal Labor Standards Act during the New Deal. Because of the southern states not wanting to ratify that legislation unless the legacy of slavery, African American domestic workers and farm workers, were excluded. Now, to a greater degree, domestic workers are included in federal labor protections, but farm workers can't unionize in states that are quote unquote right to work. And so, with the lack of protections for labor organizing, there's really no incentive to collectively, create a system where farm workers themselves can exert group power. So of course you've got individuals who say, I'm here to work, I want to earn money. Farm working jobs are for the young. You don't really see many 60 or 70-year-olds there. When you're young and you're strong and you're able, you want to work till you can't anymore. And that's the individual incentive, but that's because the collective action incentive has completely been stripped from American consciousness. I mean, we see that not just in farm labor, but across, dozens and dozens of sectors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So now this new film of yours, Gather, is really looking at the some of the struggles and issues with food sovereignty in the Native American communities. Can you talk to us a little bit about that and how, you see some of the similarities as well?
Oh, for sure. So Gather is available now on iTunes and on Amazon. And as I was mentioning, when Europeans, particularly Anglo-Europeans, came to North America, they saw the opportunity as land-based wealth. It wasn't like the Spanish who were looking for gold and other sorts of extractive forms of wealth. The Anglo-Europeans saw the East Coast not in the kind of romantic view that we have of it being wild, but the reality of it was an interlinked system of highly productive farms and highly productive agricultural zones tended by natives for thousands and thousands of years. The Anglo-European colonists saw the value of the topsoil and began creating monocrop plantations of cash crops, tobacco, cotton, etc. They enslaved Native Americans and then eventually went to agrarian communities in Africa, West Africa, and brought enslaved people over. And so it's important to note that the entire American economic system, until the Industrial Revolution and even, in the subsequent decades, was completely based on agriculture. In 1763, the British government forbade American colonists from traveling west of the Appalachian Range. Why would American colonists want to go there? Because they had monocropped the heck out of the soil, destroyed the soil on the eastern seaboard, and needed more land. They weren't tearing down forests. They were stealing Native American farmland. They needed the British support so that the British military could, quote unquote, protect American farmers from natives trying to retake their own land. And that was the economic incentive for the Revolutionary War. And one of the first acts of the Continental Congress was to open up the Northwest Territories, Indiana, Ohio, so that American farmers could go there and steal land. So the roots of the American food system are bathed in violence. The Western expansion was for grazing land. It was for monocropped corn, wheat, to send products to Europe for export, to send products to American urban centers. And it's something that we have to reckon with. Nobody today is directly responsible for the decimation of the environment, for the genocide of Native American people, for the destruction of those food systems. But we have to realize that we've created an untenable situation because of a lust, because of greed for generating wealth out of the topsoil. Now, what does this mean? In Gather, we follow the stories of a Native American, an Apache chef named Nephi Craig, who's trying to reestablish the food system in one of the most decimated areas in America, the White Mountain Apache Reservation, but one rich in food traditions. We follow a young female scientist from the Cheyenne River Lakota Reservation, Elsie Dubray, as she tries to establish science around the health of buffalo, which again numbered in the tens of millions before the destruction to create grazing lands in the Midwest. And we follow a group of young fishermen in Northern California who are trying to save their river. And these stories really combine to show that there is a deep and rich history of thousands and thousands of years, tremendous food traditions, tremendous techniques, tremendous environmental practices that could underpin the future of the American food system if we recognize it and if we give that reestablishment of food traditions some room to grow.
Mm. Yeah, can you talk about the role that the indigenous communities played in those early years in farming? It's like we were fed this this story of Thanksgiving, which, as we've grown up, we've come to realize is not really how it all happened. Can you share a little bit about the role that the indigenous communities did play in the early years farming?
Oh, for sure. So, I mean, we were talking about supply chains when it came to the movie Food Chains. The global food system was turned upside down in many positive ways as foods began to be exported from Turtle Island, from North America, back to Europe and beyond. Cassava, which we think of as a staple in Africa, actually came from Turtle Island. I'm from East India, from the country of India. And I grew up thinking that hot peppers, potato curries, things like that were indigenous to India. But hot peppers, potatoes, tomatoes didn't exist in global cuisine until the 1700s. The San Marzano tomato didn't hit Italy until 1770. Corn, chocolate, avocados, pineapples, these Turtle Island and Western Hemispheric crops underpin 70% of the global variety in food systems. But before the 1600s, they didn't exist anywhere outside the Western Hemisphere. So we all know indigenous foods. We all know, what those products are like, but we don't really know the thousands and thousands of years of history that those products have had and the sacred relationships that Native Americans had developed with those crops. And the science that they developed in order to kind of breed those specific varieties. When Europeans came to North America, they tried to create a farming system that replicated what they had in their European communities, rather than understanding the tremendous wealth and variety that was already here. You spoke about the first Thanksgiving, that feast, which was really a life-saving feast offered by the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe to the ragtag group of pilgrims and other businessmen that were on the Mayflower. It wasn't just pilgrims, a religious refugees. That was, wasn't turkey based. The Mashpee, they live on Cape Cod, and their traditional feasts were full of shellfish, lobster, venison, pheasant, corn, beans, squash, an incredible variety. When the when the American colonies began pushing for more land, they realized, and the U.S. military subsequently realized, that the kind of easiest way to spare the lives of American troops in battle was to destroy Native American food sources, to kill the millions of buffalo, to burn fields, to separate natives from those food sources. Once they were forced to rely on American army rations, they would lay down their arms. Subsequently, Native Americans, in an effort to assimilate them, were stripped of their language, were forced into boarding schools. So a couple hundred years later, they were moved. We see the situation. They were moved away from ancestral lands on which they had tens of thousands of years of food experience, and they were forced to forget their language, all of the descriptors that would be used to identify things in their environment. And so in Indian country, on reservations now, they're beginning to piece together the ancestral wisdom that hasn't been completely lost. They're redeveloping those techniques that are now called regenerative permaculture farming. The kind of hippest type of farming are the practices that indigenous people here have used for thousands of years. They're beginning to, reestablish techniques of foraging, of high quality farming, to redevelop the food systems that supported life here for tens of thousands of years.
Yeah. It's so amazing, right? They try to promote it as something new when it's been here all along. I took a trip to Italy for the World Expo, which is really a food expo that took place in Milan. And I remember, this was, I don't know how many years ago, maybe 6 years ago or so. I went into the the American pavilion, and, there were pictures of Native Americans, and up on the top was a thing of Obama talking about how, America is based on the seven generational theme of Native Americans, of, doing what's good for 7 generations out. And I just thought, I was so disgusted because it was so not accurate. I mean, yes, we have this native wisdom, but we have desecrated it. We have not used it at all in our country. And here, in the U.S. Embassy, they were trying to, or the pavilion, they were trying to take credit for this history that we basically have not identified with and taken into our collective wisdom. We've really bashed it. So it was just, I just remember feeling so disgusted when I went there.
Well, that's the first step, right? It's understanding and realizing that there's millions and millions of people that are members of federally recognized tribes, and millions that are part of tribes that are not given that kind of political stamp of approval. There are natives everywhere. Like you're on Long Island. I'm in Queens. We're on the land of various Lenape tribes. I'm in an area that was once occupied, was once stewarded by the Matincock Lenape tribe. And on Long Island, there are still federally recognized tribes like the Shinnecock in the Hamptons.
Sure.
Pretty much all over the U.S., there are still tribal communities that are practicing or exerting their own sovereign rights. There are a lot of policies that those tribes are pursuing to make their lives easier, but the ramifications have profound impact on the rest of us. For example, like the Standing Rock Sioux tribe in North Dakota combating the Dakota Access Pipeline, they weren't just worried about that pipeline, breaking and besmirching their land. They were worried about the impacts of the millions of people who live downriver in American urban centers that would have their water spoiled from that pipeline. And so the roles have always been as traditional stewards of the land, not for them, but for the land and for all life. And I think by doing a little bit of research, people can discover a rich current history and a rich current, set of traditions that are still being practiced by Native Americans.
Hmm. Yeah, my daughter was out at Standing Rock for a little bit, for like a month. She spent there
Whoa.
camping out. So, well, during this pandemic, we've certainly seen the disparity that that this virus has had on different communities, predominantly communities of color and indigenous communities, and it's hitting them much harder. Can you talk a little bit about that and how food plays a role in protecting us with these viruses?
For sure. Like, number one, our food system isn't regulated by the US government, apart from some subsidies and some commodities. The food system is entirely controlled by corporations. Those corporations have no incentive other than profit. I mean, there's no mandate for grocery stores to buy from American companies and American farms. They buy from wherever the price is cheapest. And so our food system is not created to feed people, it's created to feed people who have money. And so communities, whether they're Native American communities, urban poor communities, rural poor communities, exist at the end of these supply chains. And when supply chains were disrupted because of labor shortages and shipping and trucking, et cetera, and factories, those three sets of communities didn't actually get deliveries. I guarantee you, anybody shopping at Whole Foods, didn't have face the same shock as somebody who was trying to shop at a small grocery store on the Navajo or the Hopi reservation. And so those communities realized how little they're valued by the supply chain. And so, they Native communities in particular have borne the brunt, not just of poor delivery of food, but of poor delivery of health services. They're going to be the last to get the vaccine. They were the last to get the federally mandated stimuluses. They were the last to get the sort of support that they needed. And it kind of exacerbated the need to treat food as medicine, to realize that it's not the first pandemic that they've gone through, but this pandemic was particularly ruthless for people that had pre-existing conditions, diabetes, hypertension, obesity, maladies that didn't exist in Indian country prior to contact, prior to the forced American diet that they've had to endure the last few hundred years. And so for these communities, it's created a renewed push to develop and disseminate those traditional techniques and to rebuild their food systems from the inside out. One of our stars in Gather, Nephi Craig, is starting a high-end affordable cafe on the White Mountain Apache Reservation, which is only affordable because of a local Apache farm and because of local Apache foragers and hunters who aren't relying on food coming from Phoenix or from California, but food caught and harvested within a 50 to 100-mile radius of this restaurant. Native Americans were self-sufficient. They knew their environment. They were able to feed themselves based on that environment. And they're seeing the need to reestablish those traditions just for survival.
Mm-hmm. As someone involved with slow food, the very first Terra Madre that I went to, which is every other year international conference that's put on by Slow Food International in Turin, Italy. And the very first year that I went, they were really celebrating indigenous tribes from around the world and really trying to be a voice for the indigenous tribes, because not only was their food culture being erased, but their languages were in threat of being erased. And so they were doing a big push to try to help support their languages, but also their food. And so when I watched your film and the chef was bringing back some of these native foods, I had not really realized how much of the native foods that historically supported these communities had been lost. Can you talk a little bit about the food culture, Native American food culture, and there's kind of a movement. It's not just this chef, right? There's a handful of Native American chefs trying to bring their foods back. Can you talk about some of these foods?
Yeah, so there's a acclaimed Native American farmer and artist named Roxanne Swenzel, who's from the Santa Clara Pueblo in what's now New Mexico. And in the early aughts, she was desperately trying to address health issues in her family, and realized that there wasn't any kind of Western solution to it. And so she put together a list of foodstuffs that she knew her ancestors had used. She didn't know the recipe. She just knew the types of grains and the beans. And she and a small cohort of 12 to 14 friends and relatives committed to only eat food from that list for 3 months. And no limits on the quantities, but no extraneous foods. And after that period, I guess it was 12 weeks or so of eating from that list, they found that they'd reversed diabetes, they'd reversed hypertension, they'd reversed a lot of their maladies. Now, look, up until about 400 years ago, all of our ancestors pretty much stayed put, with the exception of some populations like Ashkenazic Jews that were, under persecution repeatedly, generation after generation, and forced to move. But our ancestors developed, environmental tolerance in particular areas. If, for example, you were born above the Arctic Circle and couldn't tolerate high amounts of fat, if you couldn't handle those foods that were in your environment, you died and you didn't pass on your genes. So it's safe to say that our ancestors developed very strong connections to the food systems in which they lived. Now, none of us are really eating the food systems that created the genetic strength that we hold inside, primarily from not living in those environments, and also from being kind of a melting pot of people from very different parts of the world. And so that kind of is the key for a lot of Native American communities, to reestablish the connection with the environment that gives them genetic strength. All of us eat the same junk diet, whether the junk is processed or whether the junk is mesclun, lettuce, and olive oil. These are things that are forced upon us by the supply chain that really have nothing to do with the environment we live in now or the environment that our ancestors live in. So there's a tremendously important health factor for Native American tribes. But the beauty is that there's no solution that fits every single tribe. They have to recreate the food system in their very specific environment. And they have to understand the foodstuffs, within that 30 to 100-mile radius of their domiciles, because that's the environmental connection of their ancestry. That's their environmental connection of the present as well. And of course, there's a much deeper cultural and spiritual component to this too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you talk about genetic strength, it's so true. When you lived in a certain area, like the Scandinavian countries, they are able to genetically deal with dairy products much better than Asian countries that didn't have any dairy in their diets. And then you start mixing it all up, and everyone's getting sick. There's not that that connection to the foods from where you live. And that's why there's this big push now of eating local, and yet for those of us that love avocados, you live in New York, you're never going to get an avocado if you eat only local. So we've gotten used to being able to have the foods we want when we want them, in or out of season. And so one of the things that I talk to people about a lot is trying to eat more local, more seasonal, just for those reasons that you're talking about, because that's what makes sense and that's what is natural for our bodies and for our health.
So true.
Yeah. So in this fight for racial justice that was brought to a head this summer, um, communities have been fighting for racial justice since the very beginning. Um, how do we get more awareness to include in like the Black Lives Matter movement that's going on right now, to include all people of color and indigenous communities in there as well? I don't know that enough of a connection has been made to include everybody in this movement.
Well, the great thing, and I saw this working with farm workers, is that groups at the bottom of the the kind of scale of importance in this country, with I guess, this is no shame, but like with white men at the top, the people at the very bottom have always been in connection with each other. When we released Food Chains, it was the weekend of the murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson, and we saw protests all over the country of farm workers with those then nascent BLM protesters and plenty of other groups that were fighting the same fights. So the movements have been inclusive of Native Americans. They've been inclusive of these other minority groups. It's just those of us who might not be from those populations or socioeconomic um, uh, demographics just don't see it. I think the important thing with all of these movements and all of those who want to be allies is to understand that folks have been fighting this fight since the inception of the United States. This isn't a new fight. Racial justice for Native Americans and African Americans and Latinx Americans and other groups is something that they've fought since the very dawn of this country, or the very dawn of their arrival to Turtle Island. And I think it's beholden upon us to understand their own organizing system and to find ways that we can be included in their movements, rather than perhaps thinking about it the other way around.
Hmm. Yeah, I think you're right, but what's different this time around, it seems like um, more white folks have come on board to the Black Lives Matter movement. It's taken on a different feel. I think the whole discussion around racial justice has become more, what do you call it, say mainstream, or more people are becoming more aware that we really do have a problem.
I mean, yeah, there's a difference.
Not the thugs that stormed the Capitol yesterday, but many of the other people living here.
I guess so, but in terms of polling data, the support that BLM had in June has pretty much, from white communities, has pretty much been erased. And so these movements, they soldier on, and it's not necessarily up to people outside the movement, myself included, to kind of understand, or to try to include them in what I'm doing. It's a question of like, how can I continue to be an ally? And again, I say this with deep respect, but with the fact that the support they had over the summer has almost completely vanished from white America. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what's the difference between awareness and allyship? Is this a movement that non-BLM or non-natives would much prefer to dilute or to co-opt? Or is it something that they genuinely want to be a part of with humility and with oneness?
Really, I guess I haven't witnessed the support disappearing, but it seems like you have. Can you share a little bit more about that? Because in all the groups that I'm involved with, the discussion around racial justice and food sovereignty has become much more prevalent than in years past. I mean, certainly within Slow Food and Northeast Organic Farming Association, and in the groups that I'm involved with, there's a lot of talk about racial justice, and as a white person, really exploring the ways that prejudice has infiltrated my life without me being even aware of it. So,
Well, so we all live in these, particularly in these sorts of issue groups. We've all lived in bubbles, and you and your cohort have always been allies with these movements, and your allyship has deepened based on growing awareness of what's going on. But I haven't been to more racist places in North America than communities that border Indian reservations. Settlers there, are their residents there, their ancestors, who settled that area, more than likely knew that they were either occupying land that had just been taken by force by the U.S. military from Native Americans, or they were actually part of militia that murdered and displaced Native Americans themselves. And so there's an obverse and reverse of that trauma. On Indian reservations, it's an understanding that X generations back, a particular set of horrors was inflicted on their ancestors. And 10 miles away in the kind of white border towns, there is the kind of own denial of the trauma that haunts that lineage. But the trauma started at the same point. And the solution is people realizing that trauma doesn't need to be perpetuated anymore. It's hundreds of years old. It's like the Hatfields and McCoys, although on a much more brutal and much more imbalanced scale. So that said, it's like those of us who are kind of working in areas where the steps for justice are small and are kind of manageable mentally and from a personal standpoint, we've always felt that we've been a part of these movements. But in areas where the gulf is gigantic and where the history of violence is so fresh in people's minds, that's where the kind of support over the summer for Black Lives Matter, spiked and then quickly dissipated. And that's America. That's the America that we're seeing storming the Capitol. That's the 70 million people that, for whatever reason, due to lack of information, family heritage, cultural, norms, voted for someone who's an avowed white supremacist just a couple months ago. So the question I ask is like, it's not a both sides matter thing. Is like, where can we actually? And I think those people are wrong. I'm going to be brutally honest and very egotistical. Like, I think we're right and they're wrong. I don't feel like feel like
I agree with you.
We saw it yesterday. So it's like the question is like, how do we create an environment for those people to grow as human beings? And if they don't want to grow as human beings, how do we force them to stop behaving like racist children?
Yeah. I know. There is no answer. I mean, it's just, I was shocked. I mean, I knew that, there's Trump supporters out there, but I really expected Biden to win by a landslide, right? I really didn't think we were that equally divided. It's scary how close it was and how many people, even with what's gone on with Trump. I mean, I actually have come out and said, I think the pandemic was a blessing. If we didn't have the pandemic, he would have won. If we didn't have the pandemic to, show everybody how inept he was and to wreck our economy, he would have won. And so in that little way, I'm kind of thankful for the pandemic, but it really is frightening how divided we are. And unfortunately, we have to leave it at that, Sanjay, because we're just about out of time. But can you just share with everyone information, how they can find you, how they can see your movie, your film, which is so incredibly important for everyone to see?
Oh, it's very kind of you. It was great to spend time with you. The film Gather, it's available on iTunes. It's available on Amazon. We're on Instagram at Gather Film, and hope people can find some time to watch the movie. I'm happy with the way it turned out. It's entertaining, as well as informative. Our characters have a deep emotional and spiritual connection with Mother Earth in a way that I think most of the viewers of the film, aspire to replicate.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Sanjay, and everyone out there who's been joining us for this hour. Thank you for joining us. You've been listening to Bhavani at iEat Green on the Progressive Radio Network. See you all again next week. Have a great rest of the week and stay healthy. Bye for now.